Hello, everybody, and welcome to another lesson in the course of U.S. history. I'm Mr. Samuelson. Last time, we looked at a lesson on the first Americans, and in that lesson, we saw how they divided into mound building and Anasazi cultures. This time, we're going to take an opportunity to look at Native American culture groups that existed right around the time of European arrival and exploration of the North American continent. So that will be our focus of today, Native American culture groups. Now, let's begin simply by saying that in 1500 CE, there were a lot of different groups, over 2,000 Native American nations. This map is just suggestive of a lot of those different nations. Trust me, it gets even more complex than that. To make things even more difficult, these 2,000 nations spoke over 1,000 different languages, which really, once again, makes it a difficult job to generalize with any Native American group. They differed. They differed greatly in their diet, in their homes, in their religion, in their government. To speak of Native Americans as a singular group is to really not recognize who the Native Americans were. That being said, for simplicity's sake, we are going to have to bunch a lot of these groups together and talk about some cultural generalities. Let's start with Native Americans as a whole. What can we say about all Native Americans that is mostly true when talking about any one group? And that is that most Native American groups believed in natural spirits, that is, the spirits of nature. And within most of these groups, you had religious leaders, sometimes called shaman, whose job was to understand the will of these spirits. And Native American groups would try to do things to make the natural world happy with them. And consequently, most Native groups had a very close relationship with nature. These are general statements, not true for all, but true for most. Now let's take a moment and look at some of the different regional groups. Let's start with the Arctic. Far up in Alaska and northern Canada, we have the Arctic native cultures. These were the Aleut and the Inuit cultures. Now, the Aleuts were mostly talking about those that live on the Aleutian Islands and this peninsula within Alaska. The Aleuts live on those islands. They mostly hunt whales and seals. They are extremely dependent on the sea for their survival. The Inuits had a similar culture, but were slightly less dependent on the sea because they lived in coastal areas and more mainland areas as well. They had a slightly wider variety in their diet, although not greatly. You would see them hunting a few more of the land animals, seals, and fish. When you think of natives living in igloos, the Eskimos, we're thinking of the Inuit when we think of those. Now, below the Arctic, we have the Subarctic people. They lived mostly in central Canada and were significantly less dependent on the sea, and they would have to be since a lot of them lived many hundreds of miles from the sea. Now, they are hunter-gatherers, but they also have more plants in their diets, and this is because they are living farther from the coastal regions. It's not as cold as it is up in the Arctic, and therefore they've got a larger variety of plants that are available to them. Now, they are hunter-gatherers, and in most senses were fairly primitive compared to some of the other cultures. So they were very migratory still, and they would move around with herds, or they would settle near inland water. But still think about those who are living in the style of the very first Americans when we think of the subarctic tribes. Now, once we move into the northwest coast, this is modern Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and Canadian British Columbia, we would see that here we have very large fishing societies. Most of these communities are not moving with herds of animals. They're instead settled and, in many cases, have fairly advanced fishing systems set up. They didn't need to farm. They were so good at fishing, and those rivers and the coasts were so abundant with fish that it provided all their needs. They didn't need to farm as well. They would fish, they would hunt and gather, and this provided all their food. The thick forests of the region also provided an important element of their culture. Here we would see these large wood cabins. You would see boats that the fishermen might go out in. And we also have those iconic totem poles. Totem poles were a distinct cultural feature of the Americans of the Northwest coast. Further down the coast, we see the California natives. California had a much more mild climate and therefore a very large native population with over 100 different native tribal groups within California. They, like the Pacific Northwest, got most of their food from seas and rivers and streams. They had so much fish in their diet that they didn't need to do as much farming, and therefore farming was very uncommon. Advanced boats of this particular group allowed for fishing far from shore. The California natives, some of these tribes had boats that could go out into rougher seas and into deeper waters, and that would make them capable of catching larger fish. So we would see that within the California societies. Now, when we move to the inland west, we start to see native groups that are not thriving as much as those coastal ones are. Inland west life was hard. Here we can see the Great Basin, and this is where we're talking about most of the native groups that are included in this cultural grouping. In this area, food is much more hard to come by. You would gather roots, you would gather berries. Hunting was also limited. Lots more smaller animals, lizards, rodents would be a part of the diet of these native groups. And therefore, they would also need to supplement their diet, sometimes through trade, frequently with California tribes. Additionally, the climate here was very difficult, as it still is today. Summers are extremely hot and winters are extremely cold, and that makes surviving both in summer and in winter a challenge for those of us who don't have heat and air conditioning. Now, when we move into the Southwest, we're going to again see a picking up of the advancements of culture. Here we have a mixture of hunter-gatherers and farmers. The natives of the Southwest are doing both. These are, of course, the descendants of the Anasazi, so they have a lot of cultural background right behind them. They can look around them and see these cities of the Anasazi that had been abandoned, but use them as a model for creating their own. So we still see several Pueblo-type towns. This is the Hopi Indians, built very much in the style of the Anasazi, although not with the great large cities. But we can see the Anasazi influence in their lifestyle. Just like with the Great Basin, though, we do have a very hot climate. Not quite as cold in the winters, but it does get cold in the winters there as well. So this is a challenge for them. But these natives were more equipped, both in culture and technology and in the climate that they lived in, to deal with this and to thrive in many instances. Moving eastward, we have the natives of the Great Plains. These are both farmers and hunter-gatherers. So we see the mix again. For most of the year, they were settled. For most of the year, they lived in one place. This is where they planted their food, and they grew their food, and they harvest their food. But they would also spend part of that year following the migrating bison herds. The bison herds would provide so much meat into their diet and would also give them leather and fur that they needed for clothing and housing. Bison were very important to the natives of the Great Plains, and for part of their year, they would pick up their teepees. Teepees are homes just made of a few slats of wood and then covered in buffalo hide or some other form of leather. They could roll those up very easily, dragged them behind them as they moved across the country following the migrating bison. Now, when Europeans arrive in the 1500s and horses get introduced to these native cultures, some of the natives of the Great Plains will find horses such an advantage when hunting bison that they will abandon their farming altogether and just rely on the bison hunting and some hunting gathering. Now, moving into the natives of the Northeast woodlands. Here we're talking about everything from the northern Ohio Valley through to the northeast coast of the United States today. These tribes were the most socially advanced. They had a very advanced social structure, and that led to large populations. The two largest subculture groups within this are the Iroquois and the Algonquin. Both of these cultures, though, lived in large, permanent farming communities. So you would see much larger groups of natives. Population density is increasing. Farming is a year-round thing. Hunting and gathering is still happening, but it's happening to much less degree. Food grown through farms is how most people get most of the food in their diet. Now, an important social feature of the Iroquois in particular is the existence of the Iroquois League. This is a representative government where each of these, at different times it was 5 nations or sometimes 6 nations, would send a representative or a leader to these regular meetings that would help to resolve issues that they held in common and keep peace between the tribes. This was something that was recognized by early American colonists as perhaps a model for how they might one day lead themselves and govern themselves if they were to separate from England. That's going to happen. We'll get there. Now, the last thing we're going to look at today is the natives of the American Southeast, down in this region, where climate and history have allowed for a very large, very dense population. These are the ancestors of the mound building cultures. Actually, this is the remnant of the mound building culture, as the Mississippian culture was still in place, although in decline, when European explorers first arrived. So they are densely populated. They are relying very heavily on farming. An important note for these cultures is also that they had the highest standing for women within these societies. Many native cultures did not recognize women as being equals. Some did, some didn't. But within the Southeast, this was a much more common thing, that women were a part of government and were a part of key decision making. And we even have instances, historical documentation of women serving on war councils within the American Southeast, something that was far less common in some of the other native cultures. Wow, that was a whirlwind, but we have gotten through today's lesson on Native American culture groups. Please remember that was all very general, and I encourage you to look into any one of those in greater depth if that is something that you are interested in. Next time when we get together, we're going to be looking at the empires of the South. We're going to look at 3 very advanced Native American societies, none of which existed in the current United States, but all of whom have a very fascinating story and really show the complexity and strength that Native American societies did take on in the Americas. Thank you very much for joining me today, and farewell.